In 1987, I was named the director of the New York Film Festival. And so the first festival on which I would work would be that of 1988. And this being my first festival, I wanted to make, of course, the strongest impression possible. And the best way to do that was to have the strongest opening night film possible. So that spring, I searched through lists and newspapers and whatever to see if I came up with something that could be my dream opening night for my first festival. And frankly, hadn't found anything yet when at Cannes that May, someone came and whispered in my ear that there was going to be a ultra-secret screening at a cinema a little bit, off the beaten track, late at night, whatever, of the new Pedro Almodovar film, which had just been finished, and would I like to go? Well, I was already a great fan of Pedro's work, so I thought, sure, why not? And I went there, and within 10, 15, 20 minutes, I was absolutely sure that we had our opening night. Pedro had already made very significant films. What Have I Done to Deserve This? Law of Desire. But it's really with Women on the Verge of a Nervous Breakdown that everything came together. Not only his extraordinary screenplay, but his razor-sharp direction, the beautiful cinematography, art direction, editing, music, and of course, an amazing array of terrific performances by what had already become a sort of Almodovarian universe at that point.
Ayer, esta mañana a mediodía, todavía era posible. Pero ahora ya es tarde. Hace ya 2 horas que es tarde.
When we think about great performances, we're inevitably drawn to drama. It's rare that we think of a truly great performance in a comic film, but among the ones that I think we have to include would be that of Carmen Maura here. She is both the ringmaster of the circus and one of the acts, and the way that she goes back and forth between those roles is absolutely masterful. Now, why are women on the verge of a nervous breakdown? Simply because we men lie. We lie about where we're going, where we're coming from. We lie about what we're thinking, about what we're feeling. We lie about what we're going to do or what we have done.
Mi vida sin ti no tiene sentido. ¿Quieres casarte conmigo?
In a sense, lies have really become almost a standard in terms of the relationship between men and women, and men have even gone so far as to invent devices such as the telephone to aid them in their lying. And indeed, telephones are a device that have really, I think, not only a frequency but a deep meaning for Pedro Almodovar. They run through all of his films. Telephone conversations, missed conversations, messages on answering machines are very frequent elements in his films. And I think there's a little bit of an autobiographical element in there because, as is known, before Pedro went to Madrid and became an artist, he actually worked for a while as a telephone operator. So I think telephones figure quite centrally in his imagination. Another device to aid this masculine lying is the whole technique of dubbing films, which is another very frequent theme that one finds in Pedro's work, of one voice replacing another, the kind of lie of the truthful image. So all of these things, I think, together lend themselves to this theme of lying, which is an important one in the film. And really, if you look at the film, every man lies. Even, for example, the Antonio Banderas character, who's a very sweet, lovable guy, the son of Yvonne, Pepa's lover. Even he abandons his fiancée, Marisa, once she's asleep, and seems to be falling in love with Candela. One sees perhaps the seeds of the Yvonne character already planted in his son.
Ay, Carlo, por Dios, con el cuadro que hay enfrente, la policía, tu madre, tu novia. ¿No te da miedo?
Family relationships are enormously important to Pedro. In Women on the Verge, you actually see his mother reading the news, and his brother Agustin was the executive producer on the film, and in fact has a small part as the architect who's playing around with the maquette. Pedro always has been very close to his family, and in a sense, the idea of family is very important. But again, it's not a traditional idea of family. Families can come in all sorts of shapes, sizes, sexualities, arrangements, whatever. It's wonderful, the scene in Women on the Verge when Pepa meets Antonio Banderas and adopts a kind of very maternal attitude towards him. It's kind of a wonderful connection that goes on between them, even though one would think traditionally there might be enmity or uncomfortableness. It's just the opposite. They feel close to each other because, of course, they both are sort of angry at the same person who happens to be the boy's father and her lover. So this idea of family creation is, I think, an important theme, and it's one that Pedro would go on to explore, I think, in even more detail in films such as All About My Mother and other films like that, where, again, these sort of makeshift but very real and very supportive families come together in quite unexpected ways. In the early 1960s, a group of Spanish directors, Carlos Saura, Victor Erice, a number of really wonderful filmmakers, began making work that was often very heavily coded. In other words, these were films that dealt with social and political issues, especially about the past, but did it often in a very metaphoric way. And that was really Spanish cinema, I would say, through the end of the Franco era. He dies in 75. It ends in 78 with the restitution of democracy. Almodovar really makes his first feature film in 1980, 2 years after that, and he's a very different generation. He's the absolute openness of meaning. Everything is on the table. Everything is out. People speak their minds. They reveal their souls in ways that would have been unthinkable to that previous generation. So I think in the 1980s you have a little bit of a shock between these two forms of Spanish cinema, and Almodovar, of course, was the prime example of that, and why he marked such a definite break with that earlier tradition of Spanish cinema. I know Pedro respects many of those films a great deal and respects those filmmakers, so it wasn't a question really of rejecting them, it was just creating a cinema that corresponded to a new era. You know, as much as their cinema corresponds to the Franco years, his cinema corresponds to the post-Franco years. Pedro likes to reimagine what a Spanish genre cinema might have been like during those years. In a way, what he often does is put all sorts of references to films and to genre within one particular film, so that the film is more than just one genre, but a kind of amalgam of several. In this film, for example, we begin with the famous sequence from Johnny Guitar of Joan Crawford telling Sterling Hayden, "Tell me lies," which of course stands as almost a sort of motto for the entire film in terms of its relationship of men and lying. There are other sequences that evoke Hitchcock. The moment when Pepa sits in front of the building where her lover Yvonne lives, and we see the various windows in the building is, to me, clearly a reference to Hitchcock's great film, Rear Window. We even have a Miss Torso who's working out in one of the windows, as there is one also in the Hitchcock film. I often think of the sequence when the two women, Yvonne's wife and Pepa, both have glasses of gazpacho in their hand and wait to see who drinks first, as kind of the Spanish translation of the Western shootout, in a way. Who's going to really take the first sip and be knocked out by it? And if you go through the film, you see lots of different references that way. Indeed, the entire film could be thought of as a contemporary Spanish version of a screwball comedy. In many ways, it has that same kind of elements. First of all, it's a narrative of accumulation, like many screwball comedies are. You start off with Pep and Yvonne, then you add on Yvonne's wife, then you add on his son and the son's lover, then you add on Candela, and then you add on the policeman. That's a very kind of standard format for screwball comedies. The difference is that if we listen to Stanley Cavell and his great work on screwball comedy, so many screwball comedies are what you might call comedies of remarriage. They're really about couples that reaffirm their vows or actually get back together after being apart for a while. This film doesn't do that. This film is not about reaffirming vows, but if anything, it's about women declaring their independence. The final scene, I think, is extremely telling in this. Marisa has been knocked out by a barbiturate-coated gazpacho and has just woken up. And she reveals that at that point, she feels that for the first time in her life, she's had an orgasm. And in fact, it's come just during the course of the dream without help from anyone. Meanwhile, Pepper reveals that she's pregnant and she's decided to have the child on her own. In a sense, this film about women who are sick of lying end up making, I think, extraordinarily strong statements, not just in terms of their emotional independence or financial independence, but in a certain way their independence in terms of both child rearing and even sexual pleasure. That in the end, they're able to enjoy these things on their own with or without the help of men. Women on the Verge of a Nervous Breakdown opened my first New York Film Festival in September of 1988, and the film was rapturously received. It was an enormous success. The perfect opening night for the New York Film Festival, because our audience was seeing a terrific film that was accessible, very meaningful, and at the same time somewhat challenging. So it had everything going for it. And Pedro was at his best. The audience was eating out of the palm of his hand. And I can just remember afterwards saying, thank you, Pedro, for the gift of this film, because it certainly set my career at the New York Film Festival off on a very, very good foot.